Right now, rain is probably just background noise to you. Maybe it's tapping against a window somewhere while you're warm and dry. Or maybe you're just imagining it. And either way, your brain barely registers it as a threat worth thinking about. You'll still eat today. You'll still sleep dry tonight. You might not even change your plans. Now picture a week of that same rain, 40,000 years ago, in a river valley in what is now southern France, with your fire drowned out on day 2, your stored meat starting to rot in the damp, and every hunting trail turned into mud too loud and too slow to move through safely. So here's the question this video is going to answer, and it's simpler than it sounds. For hundreds of thousands of years, with no roofs that actually kept water out, no waterproof clothing, and no way to dry anything faster than the sky allowed, how did ancient humans survive a single week of relentless rain, let alone the dozens of them every single year? Start with the assumption most people carry around, usually without ever examining it, that rain was a minor inconvenience for early humans, something they just shrugged off, huddled through, waited out. It wasn't minor. It was one of the most dangerous, most underrated killers in the ancient world. And the reason has almost nothing to do with getting wet and everything to do with what happens after. Modern medical research on hypothermia, including data compiled by wilderness medicine specialists like Dr. Gordon Geisbrecht at the University of Manitoba, shows that wet skin loses heat roughly 25 times faster than dry skin exposed to the same air temperature. That number should stop you. It means a mild, survivable 10-degree evening becomes a genuine killer the moment your body and your clothing are soaked through, and it means a full week of rain wasn't just uncomfortable for your ancestors. It was a sustained, compounding threat to their core body temperature, their food, their fire, and their ability to move safely at all. Rain didn't knock on the door once. It kept knocking, for days, and every single day it knocked, the danger compounded. Here's what nobody tells you about that danger, though. Because it wasn't really about the water falling from the sky. It was about fire, and specifically about how catastrophically hard fire is to keep alive in sustained wet conditions. Anthropologists studying fire-dependent survival, including research published on Neanderthal and early Homo sapiens fire use by archaeologist Will Robrooks, have found that maintaining a continuous fire through multi-day wet weather required active, near-constant management, pre-drying fuel under any available shelter well before the rain started, since wet wood simply won't sustain a flame no matter how skilled the firekeeper is. This is exactly why archaeological sites with strong evidence of prolonged habitation, like Abri Pataud in France's Dordogne Valley, occupied repeatedly by Upper Paleolithic humans, starting around 22,000 years ago, are consistently found under natural rock overhangs, rather than in the open. Think about that for a second. Your ancestors weren't picking beautiful cave mouths for the view. They were solving a fuel storage problem, because a fire that goes out during a week of rain isn't just uncomfortable to relight. It can mean the difference between everyone surviving the week and nobody doing. So if fire was this fragile, how did anyone manage to keep a flame going through days of continuous rain at all? This is where the story gets genuinely clever, because the solution wasn't really about fighting the rain directly. It was about controlling moisture before the rain even arrived. Ethnographic research on contemporary and historical hunter-gatherer groups, including detailed accounts of Aboriginal Australian firekeeping practices documented by anthropologist Rhys Jones in the 1960s and 70s, describes deliberate fuel-curing behavior, wood systematically gathered and stored in dry, elevated, sheltered spots well in advance of wet seasons, essentially building a fuel reserve the same way your ancestors built a food reserve. Some groups maintained what anthropologists call fire bundles, or slow-burning fungus and tinder specifically chosen for extreme moisture resistance, including certain bracket fungi that can smolder for hours even in damp conditions, acting as a kind of biological pilot light that could reignite a full fire even after the main flame had gone out. This wasn't improvisation happening in the moment. This was forward planning, executed weeks or months before a single drop of rain fell. And it's the exact same instinct that makes you check the weather app before a weekend trip, just with dramatically higher stakes attached. Now here's the part that reframes almost everything you just heard, because fire and shelter solved the cold, but they didn't solve the other problem hiding underneath a week of rain. Food simply stopped being available the normal way. Wet conditions scatter game, muddy and quiet ground makes stalking prey nearly impossible without alerting it, and gathering plant foods becomes both harder and more dangerous when visibility drops and rivers rise. Archaeological evidence from sites across Ice Age Europe, including analysis of storage pits found near Dolní Věstonice in the Czech Republic, dated to roughly 26,000 years ago, shows early humans digging below the frost line and lining pits with materials that helped regulate both temperature and moisture, effectively creating a buffer of stored calories specifically designed to survive periods when active foraging or hunting simply wasn't possible. Here's what doesn't make sense until you think about it. Your ancestors weren't just reacting to bad weather when it arrived. They were constantly, quietly preparing for weeks that hadn't happened yet, treating what if it rains for a week straight, not as a hypothetical, but as a near certainty they needed a standing answer for. And then there's the threat almost nobody associates with rain at all, until you actually sit with the numbers. Disease. Prolonged wet conditions dramatically increase exposure to waterborne and fungal pathogens, and research on historical and pre-modern mortality patterns, including work compiled by paleopathologists studying skeletal remains for signs of respiratory infection, links extended damp conditions to measurable increases in pneumonia-like illness, a genuinely serious threat in populations without antibiotics of any kind. Persistent moisture against skin, especially in areas without regular access to dry clothing changes, also creates ideal conditions for fungal and bacterial skin infections that, left untreated in the ancient world, could become life-threatening rather than just irritating. This is part of why archaeological and ethnographic evidence consistently shows deliberate emphasis on maintaining at least one completely dry set of clothing or hide covering, kept specifically protected and unused until genuinely needed, essentially a reserved layer of defense against a threat most of us never even think to associate with a rainy week at all. Here's the twist that should genuinely change how you think about all of this, though. Every single strategy just described, curing fuel in advance, digging insulated storage pits, protecting a dry reserve of clothing, choosing shelter locations specifically for fuel drying potential, required something that has almost nothing to do with rain itself. Forward planning across timescales longer than the immediate moment. That capacity, the ability to prepare today for a threat that hasn't arrived yet, is one of the defining cognitive leaps separating modern human behavior from earlier hominin behavior. And researchers studying the archaeological record, including work by cognitive archaeologist Thomas Wynne, have pointed to exactly this kind of anticipatory, multi-step planning as evidence of a genuinely modern human mind at work, showing up increasingly clearly from around 100,000 years ago onward. In other words, surviving a week of rain wasn't just a physical challenge your ancestors muscled through, it was a mental one, and the fact that they consistently solved it tells you something remarkable about when and how the human brain actually became the brain you're using to read this sentence right now. Now for a parallel from a completely different part of the animal kingdom that reinforces this same underlying principle, because humans are far from the only species that had to solve the sustained bad weather problem. Look at harvester ants, extensively studied by biologist Deborah Gordon at Stanford University across decades of fieldwork in Arizona. These ants don't just react to rain, they actively monitor humidity and barometric pressure changes in the hours before a storm arrives, sealing nest entrances with soil and redirecting foraging activity well before the first drop falls. Behavior that shows up consistently enough across colonies that researchers consider it a genuinely predictive response rather than a reactive one. Different species, completely different scale, same underlying evolutionary logic. The organisms that survive sustained bad weather aren't usually the toughest in the moment. They're the ones whose behavior, whether driven by instinct or by conscious planning, anticipates the problem before it's already a crisis. It's worth being honest, though, that none of this made a rainy week harmless, even with every strategy working exactly as intended. Extended wet, cold periods remained genuinely dangerous throughout most of human history, and paleopathological evidence does show elevated mortality signatures correlating with wet seasons in multiple regions, particularly among infants, the elderly, and anyone already weakened by insufficient food reserves heading into the wet period. Good planning improved the odds. It never eliminated the risk entirely, and it's part of why so much ancient technology, from fire management to storage architecture to clothing preservation, clustered specifically around weather resilience rather than almost anything else. When your baseline risk from a bad week of weather is measured in actual human lives, you don't treat preparation as optional. You treat it as the difference between a story you tell later and a family that doesn't make it to the next season. So look at everything a week of relentless rain threw at your ancestors, one problem at a time, and look at how they answered each one. Rain came for their fire, and they answered with cured fuel, dry storage, and shelter chosen specifically for its ability to keep flame alive through days of downpour. Rain came for their food, and they answered with insulated storage pits, dug months in advance against a threat that hadn't arrived yet. Rain came for their bodies directly, and they answered with a protected, deliberately unused reserve of dry clothing, held in reserve exactly like a fire bundle or a food cache. And rain came for their health in ways they couldn't even fully articulate, and they answered anyway, instinctively, by keeping skin dry whenever humanly possible and treating persistent dampness as a threat worth actively managing rather than simply enduring. Zoom out far enough, and this stops being a story about weather and starts being a story about what preparation actually is. It's not caution for its own sake. It's not anxiety dressed up as competence. It's the accumulated, hard-won wisdom of a species that learned, generation after generation, that the difference between disaster and inconvenience almost never comes down to toughness in the moment. It comes down to what you did weeks before the sky ever opened up. Every single ancestor in your unbroken line survived enough of these weeks, prepared well enough, planned far enough ahead to have a child who did the same. Not most of them, all of them. One uncured fuel supply, one empty storage pit, 1 week without a dry reserve of clothing, anywhere in that entire chain, and you simply wouldn't be here to notice the rain outside your window at all. So the next time a full week of rain rolls in, and you barely adjust your plans, maybe grab an umbrella, maybe complain a little about the gray sky, understand what you're actually standing on top of. You're not tougher than your ancestors, and you're not smarter for not worrying about it. You're just living inside the finished version of a problem they spent hundreds of thousands of years and an enormous amount of quiet, anticipatory genius learning how to solve. The rain never stopped trying to kill them. They just made sure, one dry reserve, one cured fuel pile, one insulated pit at a time, that it never quite succeeded long enough to end the story before it reached you.